Hello and welcome to another faction guide for Rome to Divide et Impera. Today we're going to be looking at the Getae, who while having one of the weakest early game armies, also have one of the most interesting and powerful early game start positions. Simultaneously, if you can survive the early game, you get one of the strongest late game armies, making the Getae a metaphorical sleeping giant of Rome too. Now, the Getae campaign also offers you a great amount of freedom. For one of the few campaigns where you can genuinely choose to expand in any direction you want without facing severe diplomatic or strategic ramifications. So, without further ado, let's look at the Getae and see their very interesting start position. Alright, so this is the start position for the Getae, and as you can see, you start out with one settlement in the province of Dacia. The settlement is of rather middling size for early game because you only have 25,000 people in it. A larger early game settlement would have something like 35,000 people in it, just like the Thracians actually start down here with more people. But your population is spread out amongst the classes quite well, as you get 1,000 elites and 3,000 warriors, as well as a lot of freedmen as well. So you do have the capacity to recruit pretty much anything that you want in early game. It's really just up to you whether you want to expand these populations or nurture and grow them as time goes on. As for Dacia, the province itself, the reason why I say that this is a very strong start position is because it's actually very, very, very easily to take all of Dacia. I pretty much did so within maybe 10 or 15 turns in my early game campaign. It is honestly a must-do because Dacia is quite wealthy in resources. Like, the population is pretty large for what you need. Like, you'll have a lot of people paying taxes, as well as up north you'll get the copper resource, which will allow you to enhance the armor or weaponry of your troops, giving them an advantage in battle. Now, when it comes to the diplomatic ties that you have in the province, you do start out with a trade agreement with the Puli, as well as military access. So you can travel through their lands without having to worry about violating diplomatic, niceties and all of that. Also, if you want to attack them, you have to break those treaties as well as wait some turns, so it maybe could slow down your expansion, but it also ensures that the people who own the provincial capital, the wealthiest faction in your region, aren't going to attack you at all. And that'll let you focus on these smaller guys. Then you can just kind of break the treaties once you know that these guys are done for and their lands will be yours, and then take Zarmezegatusa itself. It actually makes things a little bit easier, in my opinion, specifically because this is a 4-settlement province, so you're going to spend some time fighting these guys. Now, the other thing is that in theory, you could play nice with the other Dacians and just build treaties. For example, with the Daci, your direct neighbors, you can get a trade agreement and they'll basically also say yes. Then the Basternes in the north, they're a Celtic people that migrated in, and subsequently they won't really want agreements with you. You'd have to pay for them. But honestly, I just wouldn't do that. My advice as early Dacia is to just go in and wipe these guys out. They won't have particularly strong early game armies. They don't have any allies themselves. There's no reason for you to just wait and sit on your hands, because why would you? Where else are you going to go to conquer? I would conquer the entire province of Dacia as quickly as possible, and I'd always advise that 10 out of 10 times. Now, the early game Dacian army is admittedly pretty weak. As of turn 1, your recruitment options are like this, and you can see you have almost nothing to recruit from. Now, when it comes to the early game Dacian army, they also are very, very lightly armed and a lot more skirmish heavy. For example, their militia spearmen, these Getic spearmen, have 1 armor and not exceptional combat stats of only 7 melee attack and 14 melee defense. But where their specialty lies is actually in skirmishing. Look, they have 4 javelins, guys. 4 javelins, painting these guys as a more like hybrid skirmish fighting unit. Same thing with these Getic Sika skirmishers. Like, what I would call these guys is skirmishing Thracian infantry, because an early game Thracian footmen would have 10 melee attack and 10 melee defense. They'd have more weapon damage as well as 1 more armor penetration. But these guys have, again, 4 javelins. So while these guys aren't going to do as well in combat, they just have a ton of javelins, which makes the Getae playstyle a little bit interesting, but also because the Getae are focused on battles that go quickly, where you can kind of shock the enemy into submission and just get them to run quickly. This little skirmish thing might just kind of slow your tactics down a little bit. And because you do need to have something as your front line, and none of these guys are going to act as a competent front line, it's like, what do? Someone has to take the enemy charge. Are these guys really going to get to throw all of their javelins before the enemy rush them? Probably not. And that creates a bit of an issue for you in early game. Now, you do start out with having some military technology research, so you can upgrade to your next building. I would recommend that you just choose the meeting grounds because your early game cavalry is pretty lackluster. You have to get reforms to get good cavalry. So when it comes to this building, you're going to get access to actually some stability. You're going to get access to these chosen Getae Sika bears, which I rarely use, admittedly, because they only have 10 armor. And while their combat stats are pretty good, this 10 armor maybe basically just makes sure that they'll never be a good mainline. They're just too squishy. They're also a light unit too, which just makes them even worse at taking enemy charges and stuff. Your main line is probably going to be made out of Getae retinue spearmen, who are basically a Getae hoplite. I don't really like these guys particularly, but because they are a hoplite-esque unit, like they have less armor, but also more melee defense. So they're like a little bit more competent in an actual fight, but they're going to be worse at like absorbing damage from afar. But anyway, so yeah, you're going to have these hoplites and you're going to have these noble Getae spearmen who, they come from your first population class, but they're actually good at the whole shock warfare type battles. Because look at their stats, guys. 6 AP damage, 23 weapon damage. These guys hit really, really hard on the charge, and 12 melee attack and 14 melee defense is absolutely great too. They have the versatility of a more loosely arrayed infantrymen too. So these guys are actually really good, but because they come from your first population class, they're quite expensive. But whatever ones you get, they will be an absolute pivotal tool for you to use in your early battles. Similarly, you're going to get these Getae Falxmen. I say similarly because they're an absolutely pivotal tool, guys. These guys are absolute beasts. They'll kill anything if you just get an unimpeded charge against them. And they're just absolutely marvelous units. Now, they are obviously pretty weak, pretty... not weak, but I would say they are pretty easy to counter. You just have to shoot them because you only have 8 armor and no shields. You can also just run them over with cavalry because they are a light unit. And they only have 5 bonusers cavalry, which isn't insane. Cavalry won't die en masse to these guys if you just get out quickly. But yeah, I mean, if you have like these spearmen or these spearmen, if you can't afford the nobles, and you just have some of these on the flanks as well as these guys and these guys to just offer more skirmish support, you can make a pretty strong army. But because you should just get with conquering Dacia as quickly as possible, for your first army, I would probably just get a lot of Sika skirmishers. They're going to make up a bulk of your army. And of course, get your mercenary Falxmen. Always look at the mercenary tab. Get as many horsemen and Falxmen as you can, because your enemy is going to be similarly constrained, making it quite imperative for you to just get these troops first. Now, when it comes to what you do after conquering Dacia, this is the freedom I was talking about. You can literally go anywhere you want. There's no diplomatic treaties that's going to stop you. There's no real considerations for alliances that are going to stop you. You can absolutely go anywhere you want. You just have to think of what type of campaign you want to fight. In my Getae playthrough, which I have like a 25-part campaign on this YouTube channel, I went towards the west and I conquered Pannonia and then went into Raeta at Noricum. And this brought me within contact of the Romans really quickly. And I'm going to tell you guys honest truth. If you get within breathing range of the Romans, if they can smell you, they'll declare war on you. So it's really up to you if you want to spend the vast majority of your campaign fighting the Romans, or if you feel like you even can, because like I showed you guys, this early game roster, it has tools, but it's not as good as the Romans. You will be a massive underdog against the Romans. So really consider whether you want to get close within the, breathing distance of the Romans quickly, or if you want to build up your strength and then encounter the Romans later, because you could completely avoid them by just going north and just butchering Germans. And you could just conquer all the German territory. It's nice and kind of up against the invisible wall that ends the campaign map over here. So you can conquer like Lugia, Swabia, and more or less have extremely defensible territory that no one will ever attack, and just farm resources out of it, it'll absolutely bankroll the rest of your campaign. Also, your reforms, right? Your unique reform system works like this. You have to get to turn 100, and you have to have fought enough battles against either the Romans or against the nomads. And it doesn't matter who you fight, you'll unlock all of your reform units in one foul swoop, but you have to basically fight 10 battles collectively against either nomadic opponents or the Romans. So you can go east and fight the nomads here and get your reforms as quickly as possible. Let's go here, conquer the Bosphorus as well. The Bosphorus is insanely valuable in terms of resources. You'll love having the Bosphorus, guys. And then you can go further east and just make sure you get to that 10 battle number that you need. And because your early game armory has a lot of competent javelin-based skirmish capacity, you can absolutely figure out a way to fight against the nomads and fight against them efficiently. So if you go east and conquer the nomads, you'll be able to turn west with far better troops, as I'll show you in the roster overview. You can also go south and then conquer the Thracians, go into Greece, conquer the Greeks, go into Asia Minor. It's literally up to you guys, completely what you want to do. And it's one of the few campaigns where really it's equally viable to do whatever you want. It's just, you play the way you want to. You are basically a migrating Baltic horde, and it's up to you where you want to cause chaos. So that's the way the Dacian campaign works, folks. Another thing I can advise is that there is a building that's really important to have. It's one of those like yellow buildings, like the public order buildings, that you can only build them in minor settlements, but it's called the Dacian Davos. It's an exclusive building for the Dacians, and it'll give you an insane amount of public order and cultural conversion. It basically makes making temples completely irrelevant, because this is like a temple on steroids. You really, really need to get it. It's so much more useful than any of your temples, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, do consider the Dacian Davos. And now let's just quickly go over the factional buffs and debuffs that Dacia gets. Alright, so to get the same buffs that all the other Balkan factions get, which aren't particularly useful or impactful, you get +2 public order from having your culture dominant in a region, which is a little nice quality of life thing, but it's absolutely not a decisive buff. It's not something that's going to really make your campaign all that much easier or have a significant impact on it. It's just a little nice thing to have. You also get minus 50% building conversion cost, so whenever you conquer a territory and want to convert a building, it's cheaper. It's cheaper than building it from scratch. So something to consider when you are conquering settlements. If you could just convert a building rather than tearing it down and rebuilding something similar, just convert it. It's going to be so much cheaper for you. But simultaneously, neither of these buffs are all that impactful compared to some of the amazing buffs other cultures get. I would say the Balkans get like the weakest cultural buffs in the game. So take it with a grain of salt. These aren't particularly important. Now, when it comes to Dacian-specific stuff, you get defensive networks, which are special fortifications. Yes, I was talking about the Dacian Davos before. You basically are losing a buff in order to have extremely overpowered yellow-coated buildings in your minor settlements. So yeah, use them, guys. Use it. They're really good. They add to public order, cultural conversion, and give you more garrison units. They are insanely useful. I definitely don't mind losing this because I built them in every province during my campaign. Just really good stuff. You also get increased melee infantry damage. That's awesome. That's awesome, especially when you're trying to fight against the Romans. So your troops are going to be extra impactful against Roman-esque style units. So big plus. But the big minus is that you have a diplomatic penalty with Rome. So once you get, like I said, within sniffing distance of the Romans, they're going to declare war on you. You can't overcome this, guys. It's like absolutely destined to be a thing. But you also see here, the starting challenge is normal, which is an acknowledgement that the rest of the factions in your province are easy pickings, and you should just conquer Dacia quickly and easily. But anyway, guys, let's go look at the roster, the more important part of this guide. Now here's the roster for the Dacians, or the Getae, and as you can see, it's not a humongous roster, but it is a rather interesting one just because the balance of troops is incredibly unique. There's really no other faction like it. Even the Adricians, I would say that their roster is a lot more balanced, while yours is really lopsided. But for generals, you basically have two options, just like an early game variant and a late game variant. You can get these Getae foot guards, and you can't recruit them outside of as your generals, so they are a unique unit for your general. This is basically a more powerful phalanx style unit for like your shield wall here, or your retinue shieldmen, spearmen, sorry, retinue spearmen. But yeah, they're similar to those guys, just a more powerful version of them, but have the proper 35 armor that you'd expect of like a heavily armored hoplite, as well as 8 melee attack, which is better than a lot of hoplites do have, and you have like 9 here. I mean, the thing of a barbarian, hoplite-like infantry is that they tend to have slightly higher stats, a little bit lower armor, but their like formation is not as good. Like the phalanx, I feel, is a lot better than the shield wall. So these guys will have better stats than your typical hoplite while having a slightly worse formation, but they're also not particularly maneuverable. Like, these guys will travel as, like, a dense block, pull out swords, and then kill very slowly in combat in general. Except in early game when these guys are just unparalleled, unmatched. But anyways, in my campaigns, I use these guys sometimes when I had an army that was mainly made of, like, phalanx-style infantry, because it just felt kind of nice to have a stronger link in the wall. They're also cheaper than your cavalry general, as you can see here. So if you're trying to make an army cheaper, then consider the spear wall. But the thing is that if you're not going to use these phalanx style troops as your main line in an army, I wouldn't really use the spear wall, because they aren't going to be really useful outside of the context of being in a phalanx. And of course, if you want a more survivable general, choose the cavalry. It's just a safer option, because you don't want your general dying, and if you're using your general as like a frontline phalanx style troop, they absolutely can't just get killed randomly. So I'd use the cavalry. Now when it comes to your cavalry here, these guys are classified, actually you can't recruit them. Okay, these guys can't be recruited either normally, so they are a rather unique unit. I never really checked out their stats in depth. I mean, this one, they're both melee infantry, or sorry, melee cavalry for sure, because look at the charge bonuses. They're not crazy. I would say that this Royal Getae cavalry, this early game one, is really nothing special. Like 38 armor is solid, but not amazing. Base morale at 50 is pretty good, and 4 ammunition is great, so these guys will throw some javelins before entering in combat, kind of like a Tarentine cavalry. But if you look at their actual fighting statistics, your melee attack's only 13 and your melee defense is 8. So these guys won't be as survivable as many other melee-style cavalry. Charge bonus of 40 is rather poor for a cavalry unit, although it is nice the AP damage and the bonus for infantry is also a little enticing as well. 32 weapon damage is also pretty high. So these guys are thoroughly mid for kind of an elite cavalry unit. I really can't call them anything else. These guys are nothing special. Your late Royal Getae cavalry, absolute beast though. 50 charge is great for a unit that has 17 melee defense. I mean, these guys are just armored beasts, man. 45 armor, 52 morale, still 2 ammunition. Honestly, I feel like in early game, I consider having more of like a spear type general, because you're probably going to use a lot of these retinue spearmen in your armies once you unlock them. But in late game, when you're not going to use the phalanxes as much, I would probably go for this cavalry, because this cavalry is absolutely amazing. These guys are incredibly strong melee cavalry that will help you counter whatever shock cavalry is on the field, will help you counter the enemy melee cavalry, and keep your infantry safe. Moving on to your melee infantry, again, we have to kind of address the parity between early game and late game. These 3 are early game, these 2 are late game. The early game are fairly mediocre. Like I said, these Sika skirmishers, they could fight a little bit in combat, but truthfully, their value lies in the 3 ammunition, or 4 once you get that experience chevron that you get with your early game armies. So once you get the experience chevron, these guys will become units that have 4 ammunition, and that 4 ammunition is actually very, very, very useful. But these guys don't quite have the combat stats that you'd get out of, like, say, Germanic infantry, but you get out of Thracian infantry. So these guys might be a little bit underpowered. Truthfully, once you actually have your noble spears in your phalanxes. These guys are more supportive troops. You can have them instead of missile infantry, and that way you end up having skirmishers that kind of quickly expend all their javelins and then can be used as miniature shock troops. These guys will be pretty good at charging flanks and stuff like that, and beating out enemy skirmishers in melee combat, so use them to kind of help clean up the battle. Now, the next unit is your Getae Falxmen. Absolute beasts. 225 men of absolute pain and carnage. Sure, like I said, they are easy to counter. Don't get them bogged down in combat. But if you use these guys to charge flanks, they'll absolutely obliterate anything. If they don't lose their value in late game, guys, they actually end up being extraordinarily cheap and cost-effective units in late game, because it costs like 120 per turn to maintain, but they offer you 33 charge bonus and 25 weapon damage, and basically ignore armor with 11 armor penetrating damage. These guys can just charge the rear of a Roman infantryman and send them fleeing for the hills. Again, in late game, you're gonna have to use them almost exclusively as like flanking troops. It's kind of like your little X factor, but there's such a nice complement to late game units. In early game, use them to dice and break through early game infantry. If you charge these guys headlong into your typical Celtic or German spearmen in early game, they will just shred through them. Just make sure to keep them safe because they are vulnerable, but they have hearts of lions and they will win you battles. Also, 46 base morale is nothing to scoff at, particularly in early game. These guys won't rout easily unless you've done something to screw them up, basically. Now, you do have these chosen Getae Sticka Bearers. As I mentioned before, I kind of have mixed feelings about these guys because they do only have 10 armor, and 44 base morale is less than your Falxmen, and they are actually kind of expensive compared to a lot of early game units you have. Like, for example, they're more expensive than getting one of your Celtic retinue spearmen, and these retinue spearmen are basically hoplites. They do serve the role and basically effectively play the role of hoplites. So it's like, I don't know, man. Would you really need these guys? You only have one javelin volley, so we no longer play the role of skirmishers like your Sicca skirmishers. While they do have pretty good melee attack and melee defense, they only have the same armor penetrating damage as early game Thracian infantry or Bactrian infantry, making them good at armor penetrating, but nothing absolutely unique. And it's just, I just don't know what their role is, because your Falxmen are going to be better at being shock infantry, and your retinue spearmen are going to be good at being your stable center line, but it's not going to break and flee. Making, in my opinion, the chosen Getae Sticka Bearers as a little bit redundant. They're kind of this awkward middle line. You can maybe integrate a couple onto your flanks if you want, but they're also quite expensive, and I feel like the good thing about the early Getae roster, or the one thing it really has going for it, is that most of your units are actually pretty cheap. So I just wouldn't really use them, because that kind of violates and removes that particular buff. Now, moving on to your late game infantry, you have two incredibly solid options. I know two options doesn't sound great, however, they are like amazing options. One, you have chosen Getae Falxmen, an absolute upgrade on your regular Falxmen. These guys have more attack, they do more on the charge, they do more weapon damage, they have more armor penetrating damage. Instead of 8 armor, they have 25 armor, moving them up into the type of infantry that have decent armor. And you know what? They actually run at the same speed. They also have guerrilla deploy, which the original ones have, which I didn't mention, so these guys guerrilla deploy, but I kind of find guerrilla deploy on Falxes to be a little bit weak, because when you guerrilla deploy a Falx, they kind of like, they're kind of vulnerable, you know? They don't have shields. Like, what if your enemy just runs in with a bunch of horse archers, unearths them, and then just shoots them to bits? I just find like guerrilla deploying Falxes is kind of weak. You should probably keep them safe with your main army. But anyway, these guys will slaughter Romans. Like, you charge them front first into a legionary, but legionaries aren't coming out alive. Yes, they have the same weaknesses as these Falxmen, but less pronounced because of their armor. But these guys are just absolute beasts, man. They just kill any armored, strong infantry unit in combat. As long as you can get the charge, these guys are absolutely insane. I really can't talk about them enough. Like, if you use them the right way, they're overpowered, they're like the Thracian nobles, weaker than the Thracian nobles, but they can effectively cause the same ruckus if you use them effectively. Moving on to the heavy Getae assault infantry. These guys are absolute beasts of war. Yes, 13 armor, 13 attack and 12 defense is not amazing for late game, although you'll probably have an experienced chevron that makes them stronger. But where their real power lies is with a 24 charge bonus. For a heavily armored and armed kind of sword-like unit, 24 charge bonus is absolutely elite. Weapon damage of 25, absolutely elite. They maintain that 7 armor penetrating damage, which makes the 13 melee attack a little bit deceptive because that 7 armor penetrating damage will enhance this to actually be like way higher basically. These guys, they're just insane. 38 armor is really good too. That's the thing. 38 armor is like 4x sword level armor, yet these guys have actual like armor penetrating, and the 4x sword has like 14 or like 16 charge bonus, while these guys have 24. I'm just saying that when I use these guys in my campaign, they would just go toe-to-toe with Roman units repeatedly and they'd come out on top. These Getae assault infantry are super stable. They don't run very much, they don't die very much, they charge well, they hold out in combat well. These guys are just insanely stable. Like, if you can get a main line of these guys, they just blow past anything. Or basically Romans, but just more offensively minded Romans that penetrate through armor. But they can grind as well. They're just an insanely resilient, super dependable unit that basically epitomizes that historically the Dacians, they basically learned from Roman metallurgy and Roman technology and made their own impromptu Roman legionaries. However, the Getae were never going to be slow, disciplined, grindy units like the Romans were. No, they were always going to be a more shock, more bravery-based fighter. And that's how you get. That's what you get here, the heavy Getae assault infantry. Absolute beast in late game. Use these guys as your mainline infantry, you'll kill everything. Now, moving on to your spears, you get these Getae militia. They're called Getae spearmen, they're militia. The early one has incredibly poor combat stats, as you can see, but they have 3 javelins, which makes them unique. Not very many militia spearmen have 3 javelins, and I almost kind of like this, because it's not like your militia spearman was ever going to fight in combat and beat something that's not a militia spearman. So why not just make these guys more supportive and just give them 3 ammunition? It's actually gives these guys some utility, while otherwise, like, if you end up becoming more of an empire and you can just ignore using militia spearmen, you never would. But sometimes for these guys, if you want just like a really cheap skirmisher, you'll use these guys in late game, and the late game variant of them actually gets some pretty decent buffs. They get 7 melee attack and 17 melee defense, making these guys more of like a Freyo spear in terms of stats. Not bad. Of course, they still only have 8 armor, but they retain the 3 javelins, giving them this character of still being more of a skirmisher. If these guys charge on the flanks or support in the cavalry fight, they can absolutely be useful too. But honestly, like, in my campaign, I just recruit these guys and have them arrayed behind my main line like a skirmish line. They quickly throw to 3 javelins, they ensure that my Getae infantry can just decisively slaughter the main line, because the 3 javelins will make these guys' job even easier, and then I just throw them onto the flanks to help my cavalry. Actually pretty useful as a supportive thing. These guys will never be a main line, they're not meant to be a main line, but as a supportive unit, they actually are pretty good. Next are your nobles, and your nobles are more like shock style spears. As you can see, your early game has 12 melee attack and 14 melee defense. Your late game just gets buffed in that regard, but these guys have great charge, great weapon damage for spears, extremely useful against cavalry. If you have these guys on your flanks, they'll just be really good at kind of being the stable unit on your flanks. Like, imagine your flanks, right? If you have some nobles mixed in with falcons, these guys kind of hold the enemy back. The falcons quickly run around and just ram into the rear, and you just rout your enemy insanely quickly, and then you can just use these guys to outflank the main line. So these guys in tandem with falconsmen, extremely great synergy. Use them. But in late game, you might actually end up using these late noble Getae spearmen as your main line if you're rich enough, because these guys are just so freaking effective, man. So freaking combat effective. They're basically like a 4-axe spear if the 4-axe spear was an offensive instrument. So they're actually really good. Now moving on to your phalanx infantry. These guys are the heavy Getae phalanx. Like I mentioned, the difference between these guys and regular Greek phalanxes is that these guys are kind of more combat focused, or how do I put this? Like, their combat stats are a little bit better, but then their formation, their shield wall is worse than the Greek phalanx. It just doesn't do as much damage. It's a lot more defensive. It's a lot more hiding behind your shields rather than actually using the shield wall to be a more momentum-based fighting thing like the phalanx was. Now, these guys, they are pretty good pretty good. I mean, by pretty good, I mean they're kind of the only option you're going to have for being a mainline, unless you just have the wealth to somehow spam your nobles, but you probably won't. I use these retinue a lot. I mean, look how cheap they are, guys. 845, and their like actual upkeep in campaign is pretty similar to this. It only costs like 160 something or something like that. So, in all honesty, these guys are great in mainline for the price, but they won't do exceptionally well. They are the most like generic feeling mainline unit. You're gonna have to use the other tools of the Getae, the skirmish style infantry that can kind of support the Falxes that just run down everything. You know, you're gonna have to use these guys because these retinue spearmen, they're just gonna be kind of a cheap little mainline for you. In late game, you're gonna want to avoid using the late Getae retinue spearmen. They're just extremely lackluster compared to what else you can is offered in late game to every other faction. But simultaneously, they're kind of cheap. So if you're in like a desperate situation, recruit them. But these guys also come from your warrior class, so you don't want to preserve your warrior class for, you know, your heavy Getae assault infantry, your Falxmen, you know, the more important things for you. Now, the missiles that you get as the Getae are relatively lackluster. You get a Getae Slinger, which is the most generic, shitty slinger, never use these guys. You get your Getae Bowmen, which are the most generic, crappy bowmen. Never use these guys if you can avoid it. I mean, you might use, to be fair, you might use bowmen as like a counter to nomadic troops in early game, but these bowmen are not good. You lose to every other type of bowman that is good. Don't use these bowmen if you can avoid them. Now, you do get Getae youths. These guys are crappy skirmishers. I mean, all these guys have 1 armor, and then the most generic combat stats for skirmishers. The only good thing about them is that they're relatively cheap. But at least I feel like if you have like super generic slingers and super generic bowmen, actually getting Getae youths might be the best option for you, because at least like javelins will do a lot of damage no matter what. But I don't know, I feel like because you do have these spearmen and you have these Sika skirmishers, I would almost avoid using these guys if possible. Only against the nomads would I really consider breaking these guys out. It's my honest opinion, they're not all that useful. Now, once you get your reform, you get the late Getae archer, which has the same crappy archer stats, but these guys do get a spear, making them slightly more survivable against enemy cavalry. Again, still not very good as a skirmisher though, so once again, considering that your late Getae spearmen get actually pretty good, I would just bring late Getae spearmen and just avoid these guys altogether. The one interesting unit in your missile infantry options is your Dacian elite archers, your Sarmato Dacian elite archers. These guys are basically an armored Scythian archer, and it's represented in their stats. 175 range is really good range, it's pretty damn good range. These guys also have 30 armor and a pretty decent 11 melee attack paired of 18 charge bonus and 26 weapon damage and a little bit of armor penetrating. These guys, if they can be useful enough at tearing up the flanks and kind of getting into light combat, while simultaneously they do offer really good skirmish capabilities. Now, they are very expensive, making these guys a very luxurious thing to have in your army. I mean, as you can see, they are more expensive than your chosen Getae Falxmen. So only bring these guys when you're trying to make the best armies possible, like you're making your truly elite armies. But if you're trying to really be cost effective as the Getae, I wouldn't really bring these guys, like, especially because since you can be such like a shock dependent faction, you might not really need to have an archer at all. But I'm just saying that if you do want to make the most elite, prosperous kind of, you know, kingly Dacian army possible, bring these guys. These guys will stand up in the world of elite skirmishers and be a decent middle of the ground elite skirmish archer for you, and an absolute terror for your enemies to fight. Now for cavalry, you basically have crap cavalry at the beginning of the game and then get good cavalry in late game. Now, I'll show you how this works, alright? Your original cavalry, your Getae horsemen, these guys are nothing special. 23 armor is bad. 47 charge bonus is nothing special. 26 weapon damage is pretty good, but then their attack stats are like that of a citizen cavalry, and when your unit is comparable to citizen cavalry, you know they're not great. We do have 3 ammunition, but that's not like amazing javelin coverage here. They'll probably just end up charging into battle anyway. I mean, these guys are a serviceable cavalrymen, but simultaneously, if you're not a great cavalryman, and usually when units have somewhat lackluster stats like these, they have like 90 men, but these guys only have 75. Like, literally, this just feels having a light, kind of like scout-ish style Getae horseman, but simultaneously, these guys are nothing special, man. Melee cavalry is not the occupation of the Getae in early game, but as you go on the later game, you get these late Getae noble cavalry, which I covered them here. They're slightly worse than your general version. They have 4 less armor, and actually, your general's a little bit slower, so I feel like because these guys are slightly less armored but a little bit more faster, I'd actually give the edge to these guys, believe it or not. But in any case, these guys are insane. They're absolutely insane. This is a prime melee cavalry. I wouldn't really classify them as a shock cavalry because these guys will do insanely well in combat against enemy shock cavalry. Will stop them in their tracks, which is really good because you want your shock infantry to just go unimpeded into the fray and just kill the enemy infantry really quickly, which they absolutely will. So having cavalry but just really good at shutting down an enemy cavalry just frees up your infantry to focus on their main task. And these guys are just a brilliant counter cavalry, and if you need them to be hammer and anvil, they'll give you 50 charge bonus. They'll hammer and anvil just fine. They'll do their task. So these guys are absolutely elite. Use them, guys. They are so really amazing and good. Now for your early game cavalry, the rest of them anyway, you have your Getae horse archers. These guys are a solid horse archer, but they're not an amazing horse archer because 140 range is pretty bad. Honestly, they're just a generic bad horse archer. I hate to say it, alright? But, like, to be fair, when you're fighting against barbarians, you're gonna have so much, like, light infantry and crappy skirmishers, and these guys are still gonna be useful for wiping out enemy skirmishers. We can still do morale damage on a hammer and anvil, but look at their combat stats, like, they're not gonna do amazing in combat. That's just, like, obvious. That's just obvious, so, like, yeah, they're not gonna be, like, amazing. I don't know what else to really say about them. These are generic horse archers. Is it nice to have horse archers? Yes, it's kind of cool to have them as a barbarian faction, but they're not great. Getae scout riders, nothing special about these. Pretty low missile damage for a javelin using unit. Pretty bad range too. Decent melee stats, but basically any early game javelin hefting skirmish cavalry will have decent raw melee stats. These guys do have more charge bonus, so maybe more prudent than bringing the horse archers, just because these guys will give you more hammer and anvil capabilities. But also, 4 armor is terrible. 4 armor is terrible. These guys also have 4 armor, but I guess it's more forgivable because they can shoot at a longer range. But these guys are going to be going up close and personal. This 4 armor will get them killed in combat. So I don't know. Not a very good unit. Now, these Getae noble cavalry, you do get them in early game. I forgot entirely about these guys. They are misclassified as a missile cavalry, but they do have decent combat stats. 11 melee attack and 6 melee defense is nothing to scoff at. Simultaneously, they're very expensive. They're definitely more expensive than their value is in battle to bring. And every time I recruited them en masse in my army, I kind of regretted it because it would make my army far more expensive. While these guys, they probably still will die in combat with enemy cavalry, and they're just slower than your actual skirmishers. To be entirely honest with you, I probably wouldn't bring these guys, because just look at their combat stats, folks. 11 melee attack, 6 melee defense, 38 charge bonus, which is pretty bad for cavalry. 31 weapon damage is good though, but then these stats are really a hindrance. I don't know, man. Like, these guys just will lose against any dedicated actual combat cavalry. Pretty much will lose, unless it's just a really bad one. So if we're kind of looking at awkward middle drive, and speaking about awkward middle of the road units, you have your Dacian cataphracts. 10 melee attack and 8 melee defense. Really bad for a cataphract. Really, really bad for a cataphract. But you have 59 charge bonus, which is honestly not phenomenal for a cataphract either. It's less than early game companions for most factions. You do a lot of armor penetrating damage because as a cataphract you come out with maces. But then 18 weapon damage is excruciatingly low. You are very heavy, which is great mass for a cataphract, but because these combat stats are really bad, if these guys get hunted down, and they probably will because of his 5 speed, they'll die in combat. Now, you are effectively a horse archer too, with 150 range and 16 missile damage, because you have 15 ammunition. That's horse archer levels of ammunition. As you can see, these guys have 15 ammunition too, but these guys have more range and more damage. But you know what, guys? Considering that these guys, you know, they can competently do hammer and anvil. Like, if your enemy has horrible cavalry, these guys will beat the enemy cavalry and then hammer and anvil your enemy into oblivion. But if they have good enemy cavalry, these guys will get beat in melee cavalry. And because of your speed, if the enemy have good cavalry, these guys will just get chased down, beat in melee, and they just won't fulfill their role as horse archers. Now, I'm not saying that these guys are terrible. Like, they can be used effectively, but simultaneously, I don't like units that are like half of something and half of something else. If these guys are a half of a shock cavalry and half of a skirmish cavalry, and they do neither exceptionally well. That's why, if I were in your shoes, if I just wanted to have a horse archer, I'd just bring the regular one and save money. And if I wanted to bring a good cavalry for fighting, I'd bring these late Getae noble cavalry, because these guys are insanely good. But also, to be fair, these guys do add spice, and you know what, they are a cataphract, they do fight like a cataphract, so if you really want a cataphract in your army, bring them. But I can tell you that these guys will not perform as well as any other type of cataphract in the game. They're probably the weakest cataphract. If that's where I stand with these guys. Now, how would I rate this roster as a whole? I would say that it is extremely powerful. In my late game, I didn't struggle to lose a single... I didn't struggle to, like, fight any battles. Like, I just win everything. Because the combination of these late noble Getae spears, these falxmen, and these heavy assault infantry are just enough to win any battle. They are a trifecta of pain. They are an extraordinarily elite corps to have with your army. Meanwhile, the shock cavalry, these guys stand up to the best cavalry in the game, just straight up. Like, yeah, they're not as good as like a Parthian royal cataphract, don't get me wrong. But these guys will basically beat 90% of what they fight against. Meanwhile, when it comes to having units that support the trifecta, like I said, cavalry will do an exceptionally good job, but these falxmen never stop being useful. Even these late game Getae spearmen are amazing support and help you save on skirmishers, and if you want really good skirmishers, unlike these like cavalry options, this missile infantry option is actually extremely competitive and will do great in your armies. So overall, there's just amazing synergy here. So like late game, this is like a 9 out of 10 army. These guys can go toe-to-toe with Rome and teach them a valuable lesson in manners. But in early game, they're like a 3.5, man. They require some tax, because these guys are not a solid mainline. These guys are vulnerable. These guys are nothing special. Your cavalry is nothing special. You just have a lot of mediocrities. So in early game, they're like a 3.5. I feel like I could very easily steamroll the Getae with any other faction in early game. And some of my battles, man, when I was fighting against Celtic factions that actually recruited a competent army, I felt so outclassed, and I was just winning by the toes of my, you know, I was basically like just barely scratching out wins, man. I was barely winning, which did provide an interesting experience. Like early game Getae, you truly feel like an underdog, which is kind of cool. Speaking of that, how much do you really need to play this campaign? I would give it a solid 5 out of 10. It is a very classic, not classic, how to say this, a very average campaign. Early game lasts way too long, but is also charming because you get that really underdog feel. You also do get a lot of freedom of where to expand, which is kind of cool. But at the same time, this roster really isn't anything special. Like, you're kind of borrowing some standard and somewhat mediocre tools from the steppe factions. Your infantry is really nothing special. Like, you have shock spears, which a lot of barbarians do. You have these kind of shield wall phalanxes, which I don't really like, honestly. If I'm going to use phalanxes, I'm going to play as the Greeks. The barbarian versions of phalanxes just aren't very charming to me. Your missiles are uninspiring, and your melee infantry is kind of like the Adrician roster, but less diverse. Like, you have some really cool options, but they're really, really, really few in between. Like, the only really cool units are your falxmen, your noble falxmen, and your heavy Getae assault infantry. Which, while interesting, you just don't get enough interesting units. I would say it's like a 5 out of 10. If you're a Dacia fan, play it. If you're not a Dacia fan, but you kind of like what you hear, play it as well. But if you're really just kind of ambivalent and thinking, like, is this going to be a super fun campaign to play? I can tell you from my own experience that it's kind of too long. It's kind of too long for what you have in store. And to access your reforms, you do need to wait like 100 turns. So that early game is just ponderous, man. It just lasts a little bit too long. But that's what I have on the Getae, guys. Tell me what you think in the comments, and let me know if you've been inspired to play a Getae campaign. And yeah, I hope to see you in the next faction guide. Bye for now.